Part of the role of the ETF is to challenge and stimulate people's thinking, and that's what I'm going to try and do for the next 20 minutes. I have 12 slides, but the word count is quite low, so sit back and relax, and I'm not going to give you any new information in the next 20 minutes. What I am going to try and do is stimulate your thinking about your role in a self-improving system. And just to start with where we are, Martin said in his introduction, he made the point about kind of constant change, permanent revolution. And this is absolutely right. It's been said many times in many ways. Here's one way. This is Professor Jurt Keep saying it just last year about the constant government intervention in the technical education system. So it's part of where we are. Why? Why does that keep happening? Well, complex answer to that, but for the purposes of today, I want to just quote the title of a very good book written a few years ago by Barnaby Lennon called Other People's Children: What Happens to Those in the Bottom 50% Academically. I quote this not as a criticism, it's actually a very good book, nothing snobbish at all about it towards the FE system, but this very phrase tells you a lot about why government keeps intervening in the FE system. But then my third starting point of 3 is this quote from the current Secretary of State, very new, about the latest white paper, Blueprint for the Future. Well, one would hope so. That's what a white paper does. We must move on from previous underestimations of further and technical education and reinforce its pivotal role as a pathway to a bright future. So in one quote, nicely acknowledging the problem and also promising to move beyond it. But of course, the white paper is just the latest set of interventions from the government in the system that we work in. I want to take a step back for a minute and just talk about what I mean by system. So systems thinking is it's a big area of academic study, and very fascinating in its entirety. But I'm just going to use a very simple concept here and say that systems can be characterized as being stable or unstable. And those systems are stable, typically, simplifying here, typically they're stable in a high functioning equilibrium or a low functioning equilibrium. And to give some examples of what I mean by that, and before I come on to FE, just so that we get the idea, here's some examples of types of systems. So taking the bottom ones first, unstable systems. Unstable systems, typically, they either have a very high degree of randomness, or they're very, very sensitive to changes in conditions, or most typically, they have feedback loops that run away. So when something starts to change, that then makes the change happen more. And I've given a few examples, both kind of natural and unnatural. So, if we end up in a catastrophic climate change scenario where the world gets warmer and the ice starts to melt, and so there's less ice reflecting heat back, and so we warm up more, and so on. That's a typical example of a catastrophically unstable system. But I've given some others there, and they can be human systems too. If your business is unsuccessful, you don't have enough income to invest in development and premises and good staff, and so you get worse, and so on and so on. And by the way, I would say that this is exactly what happens when a college or other education institution is branded as failing by an external party. Then it becomes very difficult to attract learners who have choices. It becomes difficult to retain good staff. You very quickly become stuck in a negative spiral. But if you look at stable systems, again, I can't go through all these examples, but I've just given you a range of examples. I'll pick one example of a stable system in a low functioning equilibrium, just to say what I mean. And I'll pick highland plantations. So this is deliberate, hasn't happened by accident. If you look at all the big coniferous plantations all over the Highlands of Scotland, they're very stable ecosystems, but they're very, very poor. They're very dark, not many other plants and animals can live in them, and they make the soil very acidic, not much else can grow. It makes it more beneficial for conifer trees and so on. So very stable, but it's very poor. And contrast that with, for example, a rainforest, which is very rich diverse, high-functioning equilibrium. But I've given some other examples there of unnatural systems as well. So that's the basic idea about systems thinking. What would it mean for further education to be a self-improving system or a self-regulating system in a high-functioning state? That's what I want to talk about for the next 15 minutes. And I think there are about 16 characteristics that you can identify of what a self-improving system would look like. And I've grouped them into 5 themes here, just to make it easier to get our heads around, really. These boundaries are fuzzy, but I think this is a way of thinking that helps us get our heads around it. So to create a self-improving system, I think there's a bunch of characteristics about the mindset of the people working in the system, the senior leaders, the middle leaders, everyone. And in fact, you know, if you work in education, you are a leader. Everyone is a leader in education. Secondly, there's a group of things about what I've called identifying the work, or identifying what is the real work that needs to be done in the system that makes a difference. Thirdly, there's a different set of things about how that work then gets done, how we approach our work individually and collectively. Then there's some things about maps and pathways, and finally some more abstract design features that I want to come on to at the end. So taking these one by one, first of all, mindset. So I think there are 2 really big features that are worth thinking about here. And the first is a confident leadership culture. And by that, I mean not simply a leadership culture that is empowering and that encourages a focus on improvement, but also, very importantly, a leadership culture that looks beyond the institution that one is responsible for or working in and thinks that actually system improvement is also part of my role. So that confident leadership culture that is open to experimentation and is supportive of development and so on. And we'll see that theme coming up a few times in the next few minutes. And the second one is a developmental disposition. So this is not about leadership per se, this is about everybody working in the system. Do you have a developmental disposition? In other words, I mean, this is partly about having a growth mindset in the sort of Carol Dweck sense as opposed to a fixed mindset, but it's also about the disposition towards one's own development. Do you see it as part of your responsibility to always be engaging in professional development, developing yourself, aspiring to improve your practice and the practice of your colleagues? My second set is about identifying what is the important work in the system. And there are a few items here. The first is agreement on what matters and what is true. What do I mean by that? Well, teaching and learning is our core business, but we don't have a commonly agreed core of what is effective practice in teaching and learning. We don't have mandatory professional standards, we have voluntary professional standards. We don't have a core qualification that everybody engages in. We don't have clearly defined pathways and routeways and bodies of knowledge that everybody is expected to master in the way that some other professions do. So we lack a shared picture of what most matters for the effectiveness of our system. And in a self-improving system, that agreement is crucial because without it, conversations are difficult. Secondly, what I've called understanding where the magic happens. People who work in FE policy, education policy, and whether they're in the department or whether they're working in another place, they spend a lot of time talking about funding, structures, accountability, qualifications, relationships, that sort of thing. But actually, teaching and learning is about what happens to the learner. More than that, it's about what happens in the mind of the learner. It's about a change in the mind of the learner. It's about learning something new, understanding something new, being able to do something new, and not just being able to do something new today when you've been taught it, but still being able to do that next month or maybe next year. All the change that matters in an education system happens in one place. It happens in the brain of the learner. And yet virtually none of our discourse is about how one most effectively makes a long-term change in the minds of learners. We talk about almost everything, but these other things are not irrelevant, but they're not where the magic happens. So a self-improving system would have a really clear focus on where that change is happening. Identification of causes, not symptoms. John Hattie, a very well-known academic working on effective teaching and learning, has talked about the 5 whys approach. So when you find something going wrong in education, it's not just enough to ask why. You then have to dig underneath that and ask, well, why is that happening? And when you've answered that, well, why is that happening? And so on. You often have to go quite far down to find the root cause of what might be happening with learners. And it takes time, it can take money, it takes research skills sometimes. None of these are in abundance in our system at the moment, but in a self-improving system, that would happen. And finally, very importantly, what I call eyes on the horizon. So actors in a self-improving system don't just try to do things better, they try to do better things. So we could work very effectively to improve educational outcomes, but never actually lift our heads up and think, what are the really big issues of the day that we could be addressing? And when I say that, I mean things like equality, social justice, climate change. In a self-improving system, people are always lifting heads up and asking, what are the most important things in the world that we're working in that we could be acting on? And in fact, the FE system has a very great deal to say and to do about equality and diversity and about sustainable development, but not enough happens at the moment. My third group is about how the work gets done, how we approach the work, having identified it. And a really crucial aspect here is about co-creation. There's very good academic evidence to show that co-creation of developments in professional practice is the most effective way. It makes it most relevant to the situation, and it makes it most stickable, not just because it's nuanced, but also because practitioners have ownership of it. So a self-improving system has lots of co-creation of solutions and practices, and not much cascade or shoehorning from elsewhere. Secondly, responsiveness to relevant difference, and this is connected. So I said a minute ago that we need agreement on the core facts, the things that matter most in teaching and learning. That's true, but we also need to know how to respond to relevant difference as it presents in the lives of learners. Responding to relevant difference. There's a trap there. We can sometimes respond to irrelevant difference. A classic example of this was the learning styles theory, where people spent a lot of time and energy trying to tailor their teaching practice to fit in with supposed preferred learning preferences of learners. And if these learning preferences exist at all, which is a moot point, they're actually an irrelevant difference when it comes to effectiveness of teaching and learning. There's very good evidence for that now. Thirdly, collaboration, which acts as a multiplier. Martin and I were talking about collaboration just last week, and he's a very strong advocate of it. I'm talking about a particular form of collaboration here, which I call multiplicative collaboration, as opposed to additive collaboration. So in additive collaboration, I'm good at X, you're good at Y, we work together, and together we're good at X and Y. But in multiplicative collaboration, I'm good at X, you're also good at X, and we work together to produce X squared. And that's the most important collaboration in a self-improving system, because it creates new heights. It does new things, which can then have a system-wide effect that others can learn from. And fourthly, on this category, innovation. And when I say innovation, I don't mean doing new things for the sake of newness. Innovation can be a terrible waste of energy and indeed money. I mean doing things in new ways that work. And usually, not always, but usually that means taking something that's already worked well in another context and importing it into a new context, or doing it in a different way. And that spreading is a really effective way of doing experiments. And experiments are different from trial and error, because the thing about an experiment is it's well theorized. You have a good reason for trying that particular thing, and you have a good reason for thinking that it could work. Fourthly, maps and paths. And there are only two things under this heading. The first is pathways to higher ground. So having just said experimentation is important, that's true, but what we mustn't do, and what we wouldn't do in a self-improving system, is keep repeating the same experiments. So pathways to higher ground is about helping players in the system to see the beaten path to a more effective place that others have already trod. We don't have effective pathways of career development in the FE system at the moment. Not sure if we ever did, but we don't really now. And we must build or rebuild those pathways to nationally recognized advanced teacher status, which now exists, chartered teacher status, but also more broadly career pathways. And secondly, maps of systemic issues. So if you're an actor inside the system, it's very difficult to see what the big system issues are that might be affecting you, but that you can't see from your vantage point. So in a self-improving system, there's a part of the system that takes on itself the role of identifying what these systemic issues might be, surfacing them, explaining them, getting action taken on them. And actually, this is a really important role that organizations like the AOC and AELP play in highlighting systemic issues. And Simon's given good examples of that already today. And then my last bucket, if you like, is about design features. So I mentioned feedback mechanisms in my introduction, a very important part of a self-improving system. Having spare capacity, so not always being super efficient, not always being stretch taut, having spare capacity is key. And the ability to self-renew, especially, for example, through recruitment is an important feature. And then how these all interact together, because someone needs to be taking care of those interactions. So that was my overview. Those are my 5 buckets. And that's what it looks like when you list them all together. And then my very last thought is, where do you come in as a leader in the system? And my contention would be that a very large number of these are actually within the hands of teachers and leaders within the system. I would say really, maps and path and design features require a bit of external agency at national level. But everything else I've talked about is largely about the mindset, the approaches, and the activities done by the people working in the system. That's my call to arms, and hopefully some stimulating thoughts today.